A mirror with no reflection. What truth does it hide? Welcome to Echo Misteriosa. I am your host, Revela. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's dive in. It was during one of those grey February mornings when the London fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the fire in our Baker Street hearth crackled with half-hearted warmth, that Sherlock Holmes turned from his violin to glance at the letter in my hand. He had been toying with a melancholic tune for the better part of an hour, bowing absent-mindedly while his eyes remained fixed on the sooty fireplace. I, meanwhile, had been sorting through our post with the slow determination of a man resigned to finding nothing of interest, until my fingers brushed a thick envelope bearing the crest of the Looking-Glass Club. "Holmes," I said, tapping the seal. "Something rather odd. This is addressed to you, but sent through a gentleman named Sir Hector Montferrand, president of the Looking-Glass Club." Holmes's bow paused mid-note. Montferrand? The noted antiquarian and collector of Victorian oddities. He rose from his armchair with a flicker of interest and took the envelope delicately from my grasp. Curious. Very curious indeed. I watched as he slid a thin blade beneath the seal and drew out a single sheet of heavy cream paper. His eyes scanned the contents quickly. Then, as if the words themselves bore weight, he handed it to me. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I write in utmost urgency concerning a deeply troubling incident that occurred last evening at the Looking-Glass Club in Kensington. A man is dead. More troubling still is the nature of his demise and the object beside which he was found. A mirror that, by all accounts, refused to cast his reflection. The constabulary is puzzled, as are we all. I beg your immediate presence. A hansom cab shall be at your disposal. Time, I fear, is not on our side. Sir Hector Montferrand." I looked up in disbelief. A mirror that refused reflection. Holmes gave a thin smile. An absurdity, of course. Physics bows to no superstition. But that someone believes it to be so, and that a man lies dead beside it, that, Watson, is the stuff of intrigue. Within the hour, we were en route through the morning fog, our cab jolting over the cobblestones of Kensington. Holmes had said little beyond a cryptic musing about the symbolism of absence and the mind's tendency to see meaning in the void. The Looking-Glass Club was a tall, ivy-covered building nestled between two silent townhouses on a forgotten street off Kensington High Road. Its facade was as solemn as a mausoleum, and the only indication of its purpose was a modest brass plaque beside the door. We were greeted by a footman in plum livery who led us through corridors of brocade and shadow into a richly appointed drawing-room. There stood Sir Hector Montferrand himself, a tall, hawkish man with silver hair and a monocle glinting in the gaslight. He looked every inch the connoisseur of esoteric tastes. "Mr. Holmes, thank heavens," he said, wringing Holmes's hand. "The matter is, well, beyond all reason. You must come at once." "And the police?" Holmes asked, removing his gloves. "They have been. Inspector Lestrade, in fact. He found no sign of foul play and seemed content to rule the death as apoplexy or some such. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes," here Montferrand's voice lowered, "there are elements that cannot be explained away so easily." He led us down a side corridor, past shelves lined with lacquered masks, telescopes, mechanical birds, and cabinets of rare books. At the end of the hall stood a heavy oak door. Beyond it, a chamber dimly lit by a pair of gas sconces, thick with the scent of dust and oil. And in the center, slumped in a leather wingback chair, sat the corpse of a man in evening dress, head tilted unnaturally back, eyes staring in blank terror. To his right stood an ornate mirror, oval, gilded, and as tall as a man. But stranger still than the death itself was this. The mirror, polished and unblemished, reflected the room in exquisite detail, save for the chair. The dead man's body did not appear in its glass. I admit I stepped back involuntarily. Holmes, however, stepped forward. He crouched beside the body, his fingers dancing lightly over the dead man's wrist, his shoes, the folds of his collar. Then, rising silently, he studied the mirror. His eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said softly, "what do you see?" "I see us. The room, the chair. But, good Lord, it's empty. The man isn't there." Holmes didn't respond at once. Instead, he stepped around the mirror, tapping the wall behind it. Then he looked to Montferrand. Who was the deceased? Mr. Quentin Stillwater, a minor poet. Bit of a recluse, but well regarded in certain circles. Had he any enemies? Not that I know of. But he was troubled. Troubled how? Sir Hector hesitated. He claimed just last week that the mirror showed him not what is, but what lies beyond. Holmes's face remained unreadable. A delusion, perhaps. But delusions do not usually cause death. Then, turning to me, he said in that cool, rapid tone I'd come to know as a prelude to revelation, "There is something very wrong with this mirror, Watson, but not in the way our host fears." And with that, he produced his magnifying lens and began a most thorough examination of the mirror, the floorboards, and even the rivets holding the frame. I remained still, heart beating with quiet suspense. What, I wondered, had Holmes seen that I had not? Holmes's fingers traced the edge of the mirror frame with the care of a surgeon examining an unconscious patient. The golden filigree of the casing caught the light unevenly, and in the dimness of the chamber, it was easy to imagine how the mind might play tricks. I stood nearby, still unnerved by the bizarre absence of the corpse's reflection, while Sir Hector paced, glancing over Holmes's shoulder with visible anxiety. "You say this mirror was imported?" Holmes asked, without looking up. "Yes, from Trieste," replied Sir Hector. "Acquired some 15 years ago. Venetian, late 18th century, if the provenance is to be believed." "And has it always stood here?" Sir Hector hesitated. "It is moved occasionally, depending on the exhibitions. We had rearranged this room just 2 days ago, in fact. The mirror was brought out from storage for our seasonal gathering." Holmes gave a quiet hum, then tapped gently at the paneling behind the mirror. "Hollow," he murmured. "Watson, help me shift it slightly." Together, we grasped the thick frame and tilted it gently away from the wall. Holmes stooped, inspecting the rear of the object and the space it had concealed. "There," he said, pointing. "Do you see it?" The wall behind the mirror bore faint smudges, half-circular outlines of fingers, though barely visible. More striking, however, was the thin line cut expertly into the skirting board, where a section of the wall, perhaps no more than 12 inches square, had once been pried open and closed again with care. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "A hidden compartment, most likely," Holmes replied. "The smudges suggest it has been accessed recently. But that is a detail for later. For now, the mirror itself." He returned to the glass, removed a small metal instrument from his coat, and pressed its point along the inner edge of the frame as if seeking an invisible seam. "There is no true mystery in a mirror that refuses reflection," Holmes said, half to himself. "There is rather illusion or contrivance." He stepped aside. "Now, Watson, observe carefully." He walked around the back of the mirror again, paused briefly, then came forward, holding aloft a length of black velvet cloth he had taken from a nearby cabinet. "Consider," he said, "the play of light. This room is lit not from above, but from the walls. Gas sconces placed at angles, intentional perhaps to evoke an atmosphere." Holmes lifted the cloth and draped it across the chair where the body still sat stiffly. The change was immediate. In the glass, the cloth now was visible, though distorted, its edges uneven as if rippling across a pond. Holmes adjusted it, and gradually the shape became clear in the reflection. Not the corpse's face, but the cloth's outline. "You see," Holmes said quietly, "the mirror reflects what is directly before it. It is not cursed nor enchanted, but there is something interfering, something between the glass and the image. He took a step back, then tapped the surface lightly. It is not ordinary glass. Then what? A pane of mirrored glass with a second layer, silvered glass, most likely, that has been smoked or specially treated. Combine that with indirect lighting, and you produce a distortion that can be manipulated. More than that, it is likely angled ever so slightly inward, creating a parallax that excludes a specific focal point, namely, the chair. He turned to Sir Hector. Tell me, who positioned this mirror? One of the stewards, I assume. Perhaps Mr. Stillwater himself moved it. He had a key to the cabinets. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A poet with a fascination for illusions. And access, I interjected. But if he moved it, surely he wouldn't have done so to kill himself. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. I rather think the mirror was meant for someone else. A pause. Then softly from Sir Hector. But Quentin was found alone. No one else entered the room for nearly an hour. Holmes' expression darkened. Then we are missing something critical. Either someone else was present and unseen, or Stillwater was killed elsewhere and posed here after death. The idea was chilling. Holmes returned to the corpse, this time studying the man's shoes, lifting the soles, checking the inner seams of his cuffs and waistcoat. Finally, with surprising gentleness, he tilted the man's head and opened the mouth with a slender probe. His lips are darkened, Holmes observed, not typical of a stroke or seizure. Watson, do you detect any odor? I leaned forward, hesitating only briefly. There was a faint metallic scent, but something else beneath it, acrid, almost almond-like. Bitter almonds, I said. Cyanide? Possibly. Holmes nodded, though I would not rule out a less direct variant. I shall send for analysis. Sir Hector, who had until now remained silent, looked startled. Poison, you say? Then it was murder. Likely so, said Holmes, and deliberately staged to resemble something much stranger. He stood. We must speak with those who last saw Stillwater alive. Sir Hector led us from the chamber and down a velvet-carpeted corridor to a small smoking lounge where 3 individuals sat in tense silence. Upon our entry, they looked up, each face marked with a different shade of apprehension. Sir Hector gestured. These were the last members to see Mr. Stillwater before his death. May I introduce Mr. Basil Tranter, Miss Eugenia Vale, and Dr. Archibald Fenwick. Holmes gave each a courteous nod. You were acquainted with Mr. Stillwater? Tranter, a thin, mustachioed man with watery eyes, replied first, we all knew him, yes. Not well, mind you. He was peculiar, spoke in riddles mostly, but no enemy to anyone. Miss Vale, a statuesque woman with sharp features and eyes like polished steel, added, he often lingered by that mirror, said it held back secrets. Honestly, I thought it was part of his poetic temperament. Dr. Fenwick, a broad man in a pinstriped coat, sat back in his chair. Stillwater was sensitive, easily distressed, but a brilliant man in his own way. Holmes leaned against the door frame, watching them carefully. Did any of you see Mr. Stillwater move the mirror himself? He asked. They exchanged glances, but it was Miss Vale who answered. He was alone in the hall earlier that evening. I saw him enter with a steward. Young man, dark hair, don't know the name. They were wheeling something in a crate. Did he say anything to you? She paused. Only something odd. He said, I will show them the truth, or let the mirror silence me. Holmes's brow furrowed. Indeed. He turned slightly. Watson, we must find that steward. Sir Hector frowned. Our stewards rotate each week, but I shall fetch the ledger and see who was on duty. Holmes stepped into the hall, motioning me to follow. As we left the 3 seated figures behind, he murmured, one of them is lying. Stillwater may have arranged something elaborate, but he did not poison himself. This was no suicide. As we reached the base of the stairwell, the echo of hurried footsteps interrupted our thoughts. A boy in livery came running toward us, eyes wide. "Sir Hector, Mr. Holmes, sir, it's the storage room. Someone smashed open the mirror crates." Holmes turned on his heel, suddenly electrified. "Come, Watson, the game is accelerating." We followed the boy at a brisk pace, turning corners through dimly lit corridors until we arrived at a side chamber. Inside, the remains of shattered wooden crates lay strewn across the floor. Splinters, packing straw, and shards of broken mirror littered the room. Holmes stooped, picked up a jagged fragment, and held it to the light. Then he gave a soft laugh, entirely without mirth. "The illusion, Watson," he said, "was not limited to the mirror in the hall. Someone went to great lengths to conceal not just a death, but a history." He stood, eyes gleaming with something sharp and dangerous. "And now we must discover why." Holmes held the broken shard delicately between thumb and forefinger, angling it beneath the gaslight. The glass was thinner than ordinary mirror work, almost brittle. He turned it once more, then let it fall gently onto a velvet-lined crate. I stepped beside him and surveyed the destruction. 3 crates, each labeled in Montferrand's neat hand, their lids split as if wrenched open in haste. Inside, all lay ruin, fragments of glass, splintered wood, and lengths of dark velvet wrapping, now torn like paper. Sir Hector arrived breathless behind us. This is disastrous," he stammered. "These were 19th century Venetian mirrors, all curated for our next exhibit. They were to be displayed next week." Holmes turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "And now, someone has rendered them useless, not in an act of vandalism, but urgency, desperation." He pointed toward a narrow smear on the floor, faintly visible in the straw. "Watson, note the trace of oil, and there, small particles of black grit. Someone dragged something heavy across this floor recently." I bent down. "A crate, perhaps?" "Possibly. Or something from inside one. I believe this room held more than mirrors." Montferrand looked affronted. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, the inventory was strictly catalogued. Glasswork, frames, and velvet backings," Holmes finished. "Tell me, were any of these mirrors fitted with false panels, trick devices, or double-glass constructions?" Montferrand paused, considering. "Not to my knowledge, though some of the older Venetian specimens were constructed for theatrical illusion, catoptric designs used in carnivals and stagecraft." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Then they would be ideal for concealment." He stepped toward the back wall and examined a row of hooks, one of which still held an iron crowbar, crusted faintly with sawdust. "Our culprit used this," Holmes said, "and likely not long before we arrived. This is not the method of a calculated saboteur, but of someone searching, and hurriedly so." At that moment, the young steward who had first raised the alarm appeared again, this time bearing a small notepad. "Sir Hector, I found the duty roster, sir. The steward assigned to the hall yesterday evening was a Mr. Jeremy Ormond Montferrand," took the pad with a frown. "I don't know him personally. He's new, joined just last month. Lives somewhere near Hampstead, I believe." "May I?" Holmes extended his hand, and Montferrand passed him the ledger. He flipped through quickly, then handed it to me, already moving toward the door. "Come, Watson, we must locate Mr. Ormond at once." We hailed a cab and made for Hampstead, the cold biting through our coats as we crossed the Thames. Holmes remained silent for the journey, save for the occasional tap of his fingers on the roof of the carriage and one cryptic remark. The illusion was meant to be seen, but something else was meant to remain hidden. Upon arrival at the address, a narrow terrace near Hampstead Heath, we found the modest boarding house quiet. A landlady in a flowered dressing gown admitted us. "Jeremy Ormond?" "Yes, he rents the top back room, sir. Paid in advance for the week, but he's not been in since early this morning." Holmes nodded. "May we inspect his room?" A silver coin changed hands, and soon we stood in a dim chamber that smelled faintly of polish and damp wool. Holmes moved through it swiftly, checking drawers, the window latch under the bed. On the writing desk lay a short note, written in a nervous hand. I have seen what lies behind. The mirror was never meant to reveal, it was meant to bury. I dare not. Speak more. If you are reading this, then I have already failed. Holmes read the words without a flicker of surprise. Despair, but not confession, and not a suicide note, too vague. He was afraid, not guilty. He knelt by the hearth and sifted through the ashes. From the debris, he extracted a partially burned photograph. I leaned closer. The image was of the Looking-Glass Club's hall, the very room where Stillwater had died. But the mirror was positioned differently. Reflected within it, quite clearly, was a man, not Stillwater, leaning down beside the chair, pouring something from a flask. Holmes's eyes narrowed. So Ormond saw it, likely developed the photograph himself and then panicked. Then someone else was in the room, I said. Someone who administered the poison and arranged the body. Ormond must have discovered the photograph after the event. Indeed, Holmes replied. And that someone, I believe, returned to the club to destroy any remaining evidence. He tapped at the photograph's edge. The image is blurred, but the man's coat. Note the striped pattern on the sleeve. That detail may serve us yet. We returned to Baker Street that evening, Holmes declining supper and instead retreating into a deep spell of thought, pacing the room in silence. I wrote up my notes while the fire dwindled low. Then, as the clock neared midnight, Holmes stopped abruptly. Watson, tomorrow we return to the club. But first, a little preparation. I require 3 items. A length of thin wire, a small lens, and a theatre program from Drury Lane. Why a theatre program? Because, my dear fellow, we are dealing not merely with murder, but with performance. Whoever staged that scene meant to evoke wonder and confusion, as all illusionists do. But every illusion has its flaw. One simply must know where to look. The next morning we returned to Kensington under a low, grey sky. The club was quiet, its members subdued, and Sir Hector greeted us with weary civility. Holmes requested a final visit to the hall, which was now cordoned off. There, with only the broken mirror frame and the ghost of the previous night lingering in the air, Holmes set about his experiment. He had the mirror repositioned using measurements he took from the photograph's angles. Then, standing in the precise location from which the photo had been taken, he examined the sight lines. Now, Watson, hold this lens. Direct it toward the frame's interior edge. I obeyed. Holmes bent and ran the fine wire through a groove he had located behind the frame's backing, an imperceptible channel, fitted originally for mounting. Then, with a deft movement, he clicked something against the floorboard beneath the chair. A dull click. A panel behind the mirror popped open slightly. Inside was a hidden drawer, and in it a small silver vial, no larger than a pocket watch. Holmes removed it carefully. The poison, he said simply. Administered in vapor form, perhaps added to a drink or decanter near the chair. Stillwater may have sipped it moments before dying. The mirror was adjusted afterward to exclude him from the reflection and conjure mystery. He turned slowly toward the door as footsteps approached. It was Miss Eugenia Vale, again in her black gloves, her face unreadable. "I heard you had returned," she said, glancing at the open panel. "Have you found what you came for?" Holmes regarded her. "We have found enough. Enough to identify the man in the photograph. Basil Tranter's coat bears a distinctive stripe on the sleeve cuff matching the image, and we now know that he had access to these mirrors prior to the event." Her expression tightened. "You're accusing Basil?" "I am observing him. The accusation will come with proof, and I believe we are close to acquiring it." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "If what you suspect is true, Basil may not be the only one involved." Holmes tilted his head. Indeed, there are others here, she whispered, who would rather certain things remained hidden. Quentin Stillwater was not the first to look too deeply into the mirror, but he may be the first who tried to tell someone what he saw. Holmes studied her a moment, then, without turning away, he said, "Watson, we must pay Mr. Tranter a call." As we stepped into the corridor once more, the gaslight flickered slightly behind us, catching the jagged edge of the broken mirror. For a moment, I imagined it watching us, reflecting not the truth, but the parts carefully chosen to deceive. And yet, beside me, Holmes walked with purpose, each step drawing us nearer to the one truth behind the illusion. We departed the Looking-Glass Club in haste, a thickening drizzle soaking the cobblestones as Holmes hailed a cab with a sharp whistle. The air between us was heavy with momentum, as though the mirror's secrets had only just begun to yield their truths. Holmes gave the driver Basil Tranter's address, an apartment building near Fitzrovia, and we were off. Holmes remained silent throughout the ride, his eyes half-lidded, though I could see the calculations behind them. Occasionally, he tapped the vial he'd retrieved from the hidden panel against his thigh, a quiet rhythm of deduction. When we reached our destination, a red brick structure set back from the street by a wrought-iron gate, Holmes climbed out swiftly. "I have no doubt he'll be home," Holmes murmured as we climbed the stairs. "He's watched the wreckage of his scheme collapse these past 2 days. A guilty man tries to anticipate his own exposure, but a clever, guilty man remains still, believing silence will outlast suspicion." He rapped briskly on the apartment door. 3 sharp knocks. A pause. Then soft footsteps from within. Tranter answered the door with a practiced "Come." He wore a robe over his clothes, and though he attempted a smile, I noted the tightness at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with what might have passed for cordiality in better circumstances. "Dr. Watson. Have you solved our little mystery, then?" Holmes offered no pleasantry. "I believe I've identified a falsehood. It remains only to determine whose it is." Tranter stood aside. "Then please, do come in." We entered a sitting room decorated in rich, if overthought, taste. Persian rugs, overly lacquered furniture, and a collection of theatre masks displayed along one wall. Holmes gave the room a brief glance before turning back to our host. "Mr. Tranter, you were present the evening Mr. Stillwater died. You stated to me that you had no dealings with the placement of the mirror in the hall. That was untrue." Tranter blinked, surprised. "I don't follow." "I have since examined a photograph," Holmes said, voice cool and precise. "It captures you bending near the very chair in which Stillwater was found, during a moment when he was absent from the room. Your coat sleeve bears a distinctive chevron pattern, unique among the evening's guests. You were reflected in the mirror. Stillwater was not. The photograph suggests 2 things. First, that the mirror had not yet been manipulated to exclude the chair. Second, that you were in close proximity to the precise location where the poison must have been administered." Tranter's face remained neutral, but his fingers betrayed him. They had begun to drum silently against the arm of his chair. "Your silence is noted," Holmes continued, "but it may be strategic. Let me speak plainly. Stillwater did not die by chance, nor by whim. His death required preparation, knowledge of the mirror's properties, access to poison, and a willingness to turn illusion into misdirection." At last Tranter spoke, though his tone was brittle. "And what motive do you propose I had?" "A fair question," Holmes said, stepping closer. "But it is not merely your motive we must consider. You're not alone in this affair. Stillwater's final words, 'Let the mirror silence me,' suggest a deeper knowledge. He believed he had uncovered something others wished buried." "Such as?" Holmes studied him a moment. Then, "Sir Hector's private collection includes not just mirrors, but documents. One in particular, if I am correct, pertains to a now suppressed scandal involving a young poet, a forged manuscript, and a false heir to a minor noble estate. Tranter's eyes flickered. Stillwater, Holmes went on, was that poet's descendant. He believed the Looking-Glass Club had protected those responsible for the deceit. He joined the club to access their archives and to uncover the identity of the man who profited from the forgery. I believe that man is you. Silence. Then Tranter let out a thin, humorless laugh. You truly believe all this rests on a forged document from 20 years ago? You think I'd kill for that? Holmes smiled faintly. I think you already had. Not out of fear of exposure, but out of principle. You couldn't allow Stillwater to upend what you had carefully built. You feared scandal more than justice, but murder committed to silence truth rarely remains mute for long. Tranter rose, suddenly agitated. This is preposterous. You have no proof, no witness, just a photograph and speculation. Holmes inclined his head. Then I suppose Scotland Yard may decide the matter. Inspector Lestrade is already in possession of the photograph, and I've sent the vial for testing. But let me offer you something in return for your honesty. If you were not alone in this crime, now is the time to speak. Tranter's voice dropped. Even if I had been involved, hypothetically, it wouldn't have been my idea. There are others at that club with more to lose. Stillwater threatened them all. I was approached, persuaded. He wanted to speak at the next assembly. To reveal everything, that was unacceptable. Holmes leaned forward. Who approached you? Tranter hesitated. You wouldn't believe me. Try me. A pause. Then, Sir Hector. It was a name I had not expected to hear. Holmes, too, showed the faintest ripple of surprise. He said Stillwater was unstable. Tranter continued, that he would drag us all through scandal, that the club had maintained its dignity for decades, and this one broken man would destroy it. He said it had to be done subtly. No violence, just quiet finality. Holmes turned toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. And so, you manipulated the mirror, poisoned the drink, and left the room. Tranter nodded. He made it seem logical. Necessary. He even arranged for Ormond to deliver the crate with the mirror, told him to make sure it was prepared. When Ormond saw what had happened, he panicked, took that photograph, probably to protect himself, but didn't know what to do with it. And now, Holmes murmured, Ormond has vanished. Holmes turned, all sharp focus again. Thank you, Mr. Tranter. You've confirmed much. I shall see that the authorities hear your version, in full. As we departed, Holmes remained uncharacteristically quiet until we reached the street again. You truly believe Sir Hector orchestrated this? I asked. I believe he did worse than that, Holmes replied grimly. He created an environment in which murder could be committed by proxy. A man like Sir Hector understands people's fears, Watson. He doesn't give orders. He shapes inevitabilities. We returned to Baker Street only long enough for Holmes to draft a telegram to Lestrade, detailing Tranter's confession and requesting Sir Hector be detained discreetly. Then, as the fog deepened over London, Holmes stood by the window, watching the street lamps flicker into life. He said nothing for several minutes. At last, I asked quietly, "Do you believe justice will be done?" Holmes did not turn. I believe it will be seen. Whether it is done, Watson, is a separate matter. He tapped his fingers once against the glass. In this case, the mirror told no lies. It merely refused to reflect what no one wished to see. That evening, as the lamplighters moved through Baker Street and the yellow glow crept in soft ribbons through our curtains, Holmes sat motionless at the writing desk. He had spent the better part of an hour poring over Sir Hector Montferrand's published essays, cross-referencing dates, public engagements, and club renovations. I watched from my armchair, my notebook half forgotten on my knee. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his tone low but urgent, "have you ever considered how a man might wield power not by action, but by design. I set down the notebook. You mean through manipulation? Precisely. Sir Hector did not poison Stillwater, nor did he lay hands on him in any physical sense. Yet the crime would not have occurred without his guidance. Montferrand orchestrated the scene by selecting his players, setting the stage, and planting the illusion. He manipulated men like Tranter to act on beliefs he himself cultivated. It is influence masquerading as detachment. He rose then, moving to the fireplace, the dying embers casting flickers along the carpet. But it is not enough to expose him through testimony. Men of his standing have spent their lives, ensuring no evidence points to their hand. Tranter's confession, though valuable, will be denied, twisted, perhaps even retracted under pressure. We need something immutable, something the mirror could not hide. Stillwater's original intent, I said slowly, was to reveal a forgery that changed the inheritance of a title. Was it not? Holmes nodded. A forged manuscript that altered the genealogical record of the Margrave estate. The club's archives likely contain letters, possibly even the original forgery. Stillwater must have found something substantial enough to warrant a public declaration. And Montferrand ensured he never made it. Exactly. Which is why we must find what Stillwater discovered before it vanishes forever. Early the next morning, we returned to the Looking-Glass Club under the pretext of retrieving a misplaced medical bag of mine. Montferrand, we were told, had taken to his private quarters and was not to be disturbed. His secretary, a nervous man named Pratt, informed us with a stiff smile that all rooms were quite secure. Holmes offered him a cordial nod and waited until the man had turned the corridor before gesturing for me to follow. We slipped past the main gallery and down a narrow side hall. Holmes had memorized the floor plan, days before, toward the club's archives. A brass door marked Records, Authorized Access. Only barred our way, Holmes produced a curious tool from his coat, something between a tuning fork and a stethoscope, and placed it gently against the lock. He turned the mechanism carefully while listening to the pins within. Within seconds, the bolt gave a quiet click and the door swung open. The archive room smelled of vellum and dust. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, each labeled with a neat Roman numeral. Holmes moved quickly to a ledger on a lectern near the door, scanned its contents, then gestured toward cabinet 19. This, he said, contains correspondence and holdings from the Montferrand estate, 1870 to 1900. If Stillwater found proof, it will be here. We opened the cabinet, revealing dozens of files and scrolls bound with silk ribbon. Holmes scanned titles, eyes flicking rapidly, then paused at one marked Margrave Estate, Legal Conflicts, Suppressed. He withdrew the packet. Inside were letters, some in French, others in English, between Montferrand's father and a known antiquarian forger named Cyril Beaumont. Among them was a copy of a fabricated genealogy chart, dated 1873, inserted into a family Bible. The seal, Holmes noted, was chemically replicated. "Here it is," he said quietly. "Proof the estate passed fraudulently. Stillwater's ancestor, Edgar Latham, was written out of the line through this forgery, and Sir Hector's father was the beneficiary." Holmes slipped the most damning documents into a leather folio and returned the rest to their place. He turned to leave and paused. Footsteps approached from the corridor. Without a word, Holmes grabbed my sleeve and pulled me behind the tall cabinet. We crouched low as the archive door opened. Sir Hector entered, alone. He crossed to the very cabinet we had just accessed, opened it, and rifled swiftly through the folders. When he reached the empty space where the folio had been, he froze. I saw it then, the shift in his posture. The moment of realization that something had gone wrong. He did not panic nor curse. He simply stood there for a moment, then closed the cabinet with slow, deliberate precision. As he turned to leave, Holmes stepped out. I wouldn't bother searching further, Sir Hector, Holmes said coolly. The evidence has already been preserved. Montferrand's expression barely changed. He inclined his head, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. Mr. Holmes, how predictable. Predictability, in your case, has proven quite useful. You knew Stillwater would search here. You arranged for the mirror. You chose Tranter because he could be manipulated. But now you've lost control of the narrative. Montferrand said nothing. Holmes continued. Stillwater's findings, combined with the records from this archive and the testimony of Basil Tranter, will be sufficient to bring Scotland Yard down upon this club with full legal force. You can no longer hide behind propriety. I've hidden behind nothing, Montferrand said at last. The past is a private matter. You speak of crimes committed by dead men. That is not justice. It is revenge. Holmes stepped closer. No, Sir Hector. It is revelation. Stillwater died because you feared what truth would do to your name, but it was truth all the same. For the first time, Montferrand's composure faltered. His mouth tensed. He brushed past Holmes and exited the room in silence. Later that day, Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, summoned by Holmes with a package containing the forged genealogy, the letters, and a detailed account of Tranter's confession. Lestrade reviewed it with raised eyebrows. "This will cause quite a stir," he muttered. "Montferrand's name carries weight." "As did Stillwater's silence," Holmes said. "Only one of them deserves it." By evening, the Looking-Glass Club had been sealed. Tranter was taken into custody, while Sir Hector was placed under formal inquiry, though not yet arrested. Such matters required political delicacy, Lestrade said. But Holmes seemed satisfied. The chain had been broken, the illusion dissolved. I found him later that night at the window again, watching the fog roll over the rooftops. "You were right," I said quietly. "He didn't kill with his hands, but he ensured someone else would." Holmes nodded slowly. "In some ways, Watson, that is the most insidious crime of all." And then he turned from the window, the shadow of the mirror's deception finally behind him. The days that followed were anything but quiet. The revelation at the Looking-Glass Club had stirred not only the foundations of its venerable walls, but also the public curiosity. While the newspapers had not yet caught wind of the full scandal, Lestrade and Scotland Yard taking pains to prevent premature exposure, the reverberations could be felt in private corners of London society. Members of the club began resigning discreetly. Legal inquiries were launched into the Margrave estate, and at the heart of it all was the curious death of Quentin Stillwater, a man who had dared to look through the glass and speak of what he saw. Holmes, for his part, remained in a state of restless absorption. He paced the rooms of Baker Street as if Stillwater's ghost lingered in the gaslight, some question left unasked, or some whisper missed in the mirror's silence. It was not his usual post-case calm, nor the cold melancholy that sometimes followed great exertion. Rather, it was the sense that the last note in a symphony had not yet been played. He sat suddenly one morning at the breakfast table, ignoring the tea Mrs. Hudson had placed before him, and unfolded a letter bearing no name, only a Kensington postmark. His eyes scanned the contents quickly. He folded it with precision and placed it on the table before me. I read aloud, "There is more you do not understand." Stillwater was not searching only for a forgery. He found something else, something buried deeper. If you wish to know the truth, come alone. Midnight, the chapel room, beneath the Looking-Glass Club. "E.V. Eugenia Vale," I said at once. Holmes nodded. "She knows something still unspoken, and it confirms my suspicion. This case is not yet done." "But why contact you in secret?" "Because she fears retribution, and perhaps because she too was once complicit." We returned to the club that evening, under the pretense of collecting personal items. The building, though technically under inquiry, had not yet been shuttered completely. Lestrade, ever skeptical of spiritual overtones, had dismissed any notion of secret rooms or chapel basements as the stuff of penny dreadfuls. Holmes, however, had studied the architectural drawings obtained from the Borough Archive the day prior and found an anomaly, a narrow void beneath the north wing, sealed on all visible sides. At 5 minutes to midnight, we slipped down a servant's stairwell at the far end of the club, descending into the wine cellars. There, behind a false rack that Holmes dislodged with the pressure of a crowbar, was a narrow stone passage, low-ceilinged and damp with age. We followed it in silence, the only light from Holmes's pocket lantern, until the tunnel opened into a chamber unlike any I'd seen. It was octagonal, with a vaulted ceiling and 7 alcoves, each containing a dusty chair and a draped object. Mirrors, I presumed. At the far end, a stained glass window long since blackened by neglect let in no moonlight. It was more crypt than chapel. Eugenia Vale stood in the center, still and composed in a long grey coat. Her face, though pale, was calm, as though she had rehearsed what she must say. "You came," she said softly. Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Vale, I presume we stand now where few have." "Only 6 members knew of this room," she said. "It was built by the founders, ostensibly for reflection and meditation, but over time it became something else, a place for decisions best hidden." Holmes moved slowly around the perimeter, inspecting the mirrors beneath the sheets. "And what was decided here?" Eugenia hesitated. "Memberships, succession, blackmail. On occasion, the elimination of embarrassment. The club never needed to expel people. It needed only to frighten them into disappearance." I stared. "You mean this room was used to force members into exile?" "Or silence," she said. "Stillwater discovered this place 3 weeks ago. He never told me how, only that the truth was not in the archives upstairs, but down here, beneath the image the club projected of itself. He said the mirror was a mask, and he wanted the face beneath." Holmes had removed the cloth from one of the mirrors and now stared into it, eyes narrowed. "These are not ordinary mirrors. These were part of an experiment," she said. "Montferrand's idea, inspired by a Venetian scholar, Giordano della Specchia. He believed that by angling multiple reflective surfaces around a central chair, a person could be surrounded by themselves and more susceptible to persuasion." "Isolation by illusion," Holmes murmured. "He used it," she said, her voice growing tight, "to coerce confessions. Decisions. It was like a ritual, and Stillwater knew it. He said the club had practiced psychological torture, dressed up as tradition." Holmes turned sharply. "And you, Miss Vale, how involved were you?" She met his gaze. "I stood aside. That was my crime. I knew it happened. I watched men break down in this room. One of them, a playwright, was found drowned 2 weeks later. Another vanished to Cairo, but Montferrand always had a justification. He said he was preserving excellence." "Stillwater planned to expose this?" "Yes. The night before he died, he told me he was going to use the club's own mirror against them, create a demonstration that would reveal their manipulations. He said he would make them see the truth." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned, slowly examining the architecture, the acoustics of the chamber. His hands trailed along the edges of one mirror, then stopped on a hollow-sounding panel. He tapped it once, then pressed. The panel swung open, revealing a recess. Inside was a folder, wrapped in oilskin. Holmes drew it out and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, grainy but legible. Stillwater had clearly documented the chapel room in use. Men seated, Montferrand standing, faces caught in half-shadow, none looking directly at the lens. Among them, unmistakably, was Sir Hector. And one photo, a recent one, showed Stillwater seated in the central chair, facing the mirror. Behind him, barely visible in the reflection, stood Basil Tranter, holding a vial. Holmes exhaled slowly. He documented the crime, or at least the staging of it. Eugenia looked away. I don't think he believed he'd survive. Holmes returned the folder to his coat. This is what remains when truth becomes unacceptable. Documentation in place of voice. A man silenced, but not erased. She stepped forward. What will happen now? Holmes's voice was low. That depends on Scotland Yard. But I shall see to it that the press receives the photographs. Discreetly, but certainly. The club will fall, and those who enabled its practices will be known. Eugenia Vale nodded, a look of quiet resignation settling over her. As we ascended the tunnel once more, leaving the chapel room to the cold and its own silence, I could not help but feel the weight of the space behind us. A chamber where reflections had been weaponized and truth twisted into torment. Back in the light of Baker Street, Holmes placed the photographs on the table, spreading them like cards in a magician's trick laid bare. He stared at them for a long time, then finally spoke. Stillwater did not die in vain. He found the face beneath the mask. And this time, there was no illusion left. It was in the cold, pale light of early dawn that Holmes finished arranging the photographs upon our sitting-room table. He studied them not with the satisfaction of victory, but with the clinical exactitude of a surgeon inspecting the root of an illness after a harrowing operation. Each image, Stillwater in the central chair, Tranter in motion behind him, Sir Hector presiding over a twisted tribunal of mirrors, spoke not just of crime, but of a culture deliberately cultivated in shadow. The deception was not singular, but systemic. "We've uncovered the mechanics," Holmes murmured, "but it is not yet enough." I looked up from where I had been reviewing the notes we'd gathered since Stillwater's death. "Not enough for the Yard? Or not enough for you?" "For justice," Holmes said flatly. "Lestrade has the confession from Tranter, the forged inheritance documents, and now Stillwater's photographs. That will suffice to bring formal charges, perhaps even scandal enough to dismantle the Looking-Glass Club in the court of public opinion. But a structure that tolerates corruption will only rebuild itself, Watson. What concerns me now is whether we have fully traced the infection." He paced then, swift and silent, until he halted beside the fireplace. "Stillwater," he continued, "was the visible wound. But he did not open it without help. There was another hand guiding his path. Someone who helped him locate that chapel room, who gave him access to the documents. Miss Vale may have known what occurred, but I believe there was someone else, someone more deeply embedded in the club's hierarchy, who aided him." "You suspect a second accomplice?" "An ally, rather. Stillwater was not naive. He was methodical. He must have had a confidant." I frowned. "But how would such a person remain unknown?" "Because they are still hiding," Holmes replied, "even now that the truth has emerged, and I believe they have tried, once already, to erase their part." He drew from his coat a scrap of notepaper I hadn't yet seen. It was torn along the top edge, as though ripped hastily from a longer message. On it, in a neat and deliberate script, were the words, "The last reflection is not in the mirror." "I found this in the oilskin folder," he explained, "folded behind the final photograph. It is unsigned, but it bears the same hand as the invitation Stillwater received that first brought him to the Looking-Glass Club." I leaned forward. "So someone lured him in?" "Not lured, guided, like a stage manager directing an actor toward the curtain." "And that person is still at large?" Just then, a knock interrupted our thoughts. It was Lestrade, dressed in his full morning coat, mustache twitching with impatience. "I thought you'd want to know," he said once inside. "Sir Hector has fled." Holmes's eyes flashed. "When?" "Sometime last night. He was being held under a quiet restriction, no formal arrest, mind. But this morning his housekeeper found his bed untouched. Back door unbolted. Servants heard nothing." Holmes turned sharply. "He will attempt to destroy what remains." "Which is why I'm here," Lestrade continued. His valet mentioned something odd. He took with him a single leather case and a small oblong object wrapped in silk. Wouldn't speak a word before leaving. A mirror, Holmes said instantly. One of the originals from the chapel room, no doubt. Stillwater's photos prove Montferrand's role, but possession of one of those mirrors, used in the coercion rituals, could allow him to manipulate evidence. If he can destroy it or pass it off as part of a private collection. He's buying silence all over again, I muttered. Holmes had already donned his coat and was reaching for his hat. Where would he go to vanish and still retain control of the narrative? Lestrade shook his head. We're checking the ports, the trains. No, he won't flee yet, Holmes interrupted. Not until he's destroyed his trail. He's proud, Lestrade. He wants the last move. There's one place we haven't searched fully. The Montferrand mausoleum. I blinked. The family crypt? Holmes nodded. At Kensal Green. It houses 3 generations of the Montferrand line, including the estate's earliest forgers. Stillwater mentioned once in his notes that he believed something was buried there, not metaphorically, but literally. Lestrade exhaled. Then let's be off. We arrived at Kensal Green as the sky began to mist, the stone monuments lined like mourners under a grey veil. The Montferrand mausoleum was easy to find, an imposing structure of granite and iron, its arched door carved with Latin epigrams and family crests. The gates were locked, but Holmes produced a key, not of brass, but deduction. The club's floor plans, he said, slipping a tension wrench into the old lock. Same architectural firm, I suspected the locking mechanisms would match. With a final click, the gate gave way. Inside was a cool silence, thick with the scent of damp stone and aging brass. We descended narrow steps to a crypt lined with shelves. Dust lay thick on the nameplates, but the center of the room had been disturbed. A wooden plinth stood empty, and beside it, fresh prints in the dust. He's been here, Holmes said, crouching. Within the last hour. A clatter echoed from behind the vault wall. Holmes rose in an instant and turned toward a darkened archway beyond the sarcophagi. Stay here, Lestrade, he said. Watson, with me. We moved swiftly through the arch into a chamber deeper still. And there, standing before a brazier of coal and a shattered mirror frame, was Sir Hector Montferrand. He held a hammer in one hand, and in the other, a bundle of papers. Stillwater's final correspondence. He turned as we entered, unhurried. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you've come for the epilogue. You won't burn those, Holmes said coldly. Montferrand tilted his head. No, you've already exposed me. What remains but to choose the manner of my defeat? Holmes took a step forward. Stillwater was not merely a threat to your reputation. He was a threat to your design, a mirror unto your empire of illusion. Montferrand's eyes gleamed, and yet he was always destined to fail. Men like him speak, and society shrinks back. But I offered structure, identity. You offered lies, Holmes snapped, and you cultivated men who would kill to protect them. Montferrand looked down at the burning coals. For a moment, I thought he might cast the papers in, but then his hand trembled. The firelight danced across his face, and whatever defiance remained flickered like a dying lamp. He let the bundle fall to the floor. Holmes moved forward and retrieved them quickly. Behind us, Lestrade appeared, revolver raised, just as Montferrand dropped the hammer with a dull clang. I'll come quietly, he said. That night, as we sat once again by the hearth, Holmes reviewed Stillwater's final letters. They contained a complete narrative of the chapel room's use, names of complicit members, and a final passage written in his own hand. If truth does not reflect in the mirror, it must be carried in the eyes of those who survive. Holmes closed the folio, leaned back, and said quietly, Stillwater never wanted vengeance. He wanted a reckoning. And he has it, I said. Holmes nodded, but his gaze remained on the dying fire, where a faint gleam from the glass of a framed photograph on the mantel caught the light. "No," he murmured. "He has only just begun to be seen." The morning after Sir Hector's capture dawned clear, uncharacteristically bright for a London March. The previous week's rain had washed the city in cold silver, but now Baker Street basked in a brief spell of stillness. I had half expected Holmes to spend the day immersed in the final collation of evidence, his usual practice after a complex case. But he was uncharacteristically still, sitting not at his desk but in the high-backed chair near the hearth, staring without distraction into the curling tendrils of smoke rising from his pipe. He had not spoken since breakfast. "You don't believe it's finished?" I said at last. He didn't look at me. "No." I set down my cup. "Montferrand has been turned over to the authorities. The letters are intact. The photographs are in Lestrade's hands. Stillwater's account, signed and witnessed, will be read in court. What remains?" Holmes drew in smoke, exhaled slowly, and tapped the side of the pipe against the edge of the chair. "The mirror, Watson." I frowned. "The one in the mausoleum?" "No," he said softly. "The one that refused to reflect. The one that began this case. It was never recovered." I sat forward. "You believe it still exists?" "I believe Montferrand destroyed one of the mirrors in the chapel, yes. But the original, the one from the hall of the Looking-Glass Club, the one Stillwater altered for his demonstration, was swapped prior to his death." He rose and crossed to the desk, where the surviving photographs had been spread out. One in particular he placed before me, Stillwater seated in the ornate chair, the mirror looming behind him like a theatre's proscenium. "Study the frame," Holmes said. "This image was taken the day before Stillwater's death, and yet the gilding on the mirror's right edge has a visible crack. That same crack is absent in the mirror Lestrade retrieved from the club after the incident. Someone replaced it, likely during the confusion of the body's removal." "But to what end?" Holmes's voice sharpened. "Because it was not a mirror. It was a device, carefully engineered, with its angles and treatments designed not simply to emit a reflection, but to frame a narrative. Stillwater built it, yes, but under guidance. Someone else aided in its construction, and then ensured it vanished after his death." I understood then the restlessness in Holmes, the intangible weight that had not lifted even with the culprit in custody. The mechanism of the murder had not been fully unveiled. We had seen the hand that delivered the blow, but not the artisan who forged the weapon. "If Montferrand was the mind," I said slowly, "and Tranter the hand, then this other figure was the architect," Holmes finished, "and I believe they are still free." He moved to the bureau and drew out a card. Eugenia Vale's calling card, which she had left upon departing Baker Street 2 days earlier. "She never mentioned the mirror's disappearance," Holmes said, "though she must have noticed. That room was her sanctuary once. Her silence is either deliberate or born of fear." I stood. "Shall we pay her a visit?" Holmes nodded. "There is one last curtain to draw." We found Miss Vale in her Bloomsbury lodgings, a modest second-floor flat above a printing house. She admitted us with grace, but behind her poise was a wariness that had not been present before. She offered tea, which Holmes declined, and seated herself across from us, hands folded tightly in her lap. "You've come about Hector," she said. "No," Holmes replied. "We've come about the mirror." She looked at him, and for a moment the facade held. Then she sighed and turned her face slightly away. "You noticed it was gone," Holmes said. "Perhaps even helped remove it." Her silence was answer enough. Holmes continued. "Stillwater engineered it for theatrical exposure. But it was too effective. The mirror made the room itself an accomplice. It shifted suspicion. It created legend. And after his death, someone ensured that this artifact, the proof of what had been constructed, vanished." "I had it taken to safety," she said at last. "I didn't destroy it." "Why?" Because it was his legacy, she said almost fiercely. You think Stillwater was naive? He wasn't. He knew he wouldn't survive. The mirror was his voice. He designed it as both a protest and a monument. And where is it now? Holmes asked. She hesitated, then said, He left instructions. He wanted it displayed, not in a museum, but in a place where it would be seen, not as an oddity, but as a warning. Holmes sat forward. Where? A theatre, the old Orpheum in Islington. It closed 2 years ago. Stillwater once performed spoken verse there in his youth. He left a letter with the caretaker, instructing the mirror be installed backstage, behind the proscenium. Hidden but present, an invisible reminder of what power can become when bent inward. Holmes was on his feet before she finished speaking. We arrived at the Orpheum that afternoon. The building had been partially gutted, its velvet drapes molding in silence, its seats coated with dust. Yet backstage, behind a rusted panel once used for pulley access, we found the mirror. It was mounted upright within a wooden case, untouched. Holmes uncovered it slowly, and we both stepped back. Even in the dimness of that forgotten hall, it held its menace. No longer a passive reflection, but a device designed to direct belief, to erase presence. Stillwater had built not a mirror, but a lens through which narrative could be rewritten. Holmes touched the edge and whispered, He made his ghost visible. We spent an hour documenting it, its curvature, construction, glass treatment. Holmes photographed every inch, including the inscription hidden beneath its base. Truth begins in silence. That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes sent a sealed envelope to Lestrade containing the location and details of the mirror's construction. Another copy he mailed to the British Museum's Department of Psychological Artifacts. As for the mirror itself, Holmes left it where it stood. Some truths, he said, were best left haunting empty theaters where illusion belonged. The final stage was struck. Stillwater's voice had been heard. The mask had cracked, and at last, the mirror reflected nothing more than it should. For several days after our visit to the Orpheum, Baker Street remained unusually quiet. There was no immediate summons from Scotland Yard, no urgent telegram sliding beneath our door, and for once no fog of mystery lingering over Holmes's every movement. Yet I knew better than to mistake his stillness for repose. He was thinking, layer by layer from the outside in, still unwinding the knotted silk threads of the Looking-Glass Club's deceptions. It was on the 4th morning, while I was halfway through the day's newspaper and Holmes sat fingering a violin string without drawing the bow, that a discreet knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson showed in none other than Inspector Lestrade, his expression one of exasperation only barely veiled behind official civility. Holmes rose at once. What is it, Lestrade? Trouble, the inspector replied bluntly. The kind you warned me about. He removed his bowler, glanced at me, and then handed Holmes a folded slip of newsprint, an advance sheet, still damp from the press. Holmes read the headline aloud. Phantom Theatre, Mysterious Mirror, found behind stage. Anarchist symbolism suspected. He scanned the first few paragraphs silently, then handed the sheet to me. The story, though thin on specifics, described how a contractor hired to survey the Orpheum for renovation had uncovered a strange mirrored apparatus hidden in the theatre's backstage infrastructure. The piece speculated, with typical Fleet Street flair, on secret societies, encoded warnings, and the theatre's dark legacy. They've already removed it, Lestrade said. Took it to a private facility on Finchley Road. Some fellow from the Museum of Psychological Artifacts got wind and acted before I could intervene. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Which fellow? Lestrade consulted a second note. Dr. Calhoun, Elias Calhoun, said he'd been notified by letter, had credentials, references, the whole lot. Holmes's voice lowered. He wasn't on their official staff roster when I last checked. No, Lestrade agreed, which is why I came straight to you. Holmes moved to his desk and, without another word, withdrew the carbon copy of the letter he had sent to the museum. He studied it for a moment. Then, with one swift movement, he held it over the flame of the lamp and let it burn. "Calhoun is the architect," he said softly. I stood. Stillwater's silent partner? No, his silent observer. Stillwater believed he was being helped, but I suspect now he was being studied. The construction of that mirror required precise measurements, specialized knowledge in reflective geometry and glass treatment. Stillwater was an artist, but the one who guided his hand, who ensured the illusion functioned precisely, must have been a technician of a very specific breed. And I believe Calhoun saw in Stillwater not a partner, but a prototype. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "You think this man intends to replicate it?" Holmes nodded. Not for murder, perhaps, but for control. He moved suddenly, energetically, gathering his coat. "We go to Finchley Road." Within the hour, we found ourselves standing at the entrance to a modest 3-story structure that bore no sign but a single brass number plate, 107C. The building had once been a small sanitarium, long since shuttered and converted into storage for archival acquisitions. A man in a brown coat and round spectacles met us at the door, introducing himself as Doctor. Elias Calhoun with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly. "How very prompt of you. I'd half expected you to arrive." Holmes returned the gaze without greeting. "You have possession of the Orpheum mirror." "I do," Calhoun replied. "It was transferred early this morning. I assure you it's being preserved." "Preserved?" Holmes repeated. "Not destroyed." Calhoun raised an eyebrow. "Would you destroy a Rembrandt sketch because it unsettled you?" "A mirror that erases presence is not art," Holmes said evenly. "It is an instrument, one already used for death." Calhoun gestured for us to follow. "Then perhaps it is better here than lost to ignorance." He led us down a narrow hallway into a storage room, temperature-controlled and faintly redolent of iodine and lacquer. There, under a linen cover and surrounded by trays of silver nitrate instruments, stood the mirror. It gleamed faintly even beneath the cloth, as though it remembered its purpose. Holmes stepped forward and peeled back the cover. For a moment, none of us spoke. Even in the sterile light of the archive, the mirror retained its eerie precision, its surface calm, but its angles subtly wrong, designed not to reflect what was there, but what was desired. "You understand what this is," Holmes said almost quietly. "You understand the implication of building such a device." Calhoun smiled thinly. "I understand that perception is malleable, that with the right optical manipulation, a man may be made to question even his own absence. And how long have you believed that?" "Since long before Mr. Stillwater," Calhoun said. "He was merely the first to construct what I could only sketch. He had the obsession, I provided the mathematics." Holmes's expression grew cold. "You engineered a man's descent into obsession and watched him die, all for academic curiosity." Calhoun shrugged. "He wished to be remembered. And he is." Holmes turned abruptly to Lestrade. "This facility must be secured. This mirror removed and destroyed. Calhoun is to be detained for questioning, under suspicion of accessory to murder." Lestrade nodded grimly. But before he could move, Calhoun spoke again. "You cannot stop what it represents. The mirror is only a beginning. It's not the illusion that kills, Mr. Holmes. It's the belief." Holmes stepped close. "And belief without truth is the oldest poison known to man." Calhoun did not resist as Lestrade placed him under custody. His expression never faltered. He seemed almost proud. That night, back in our rooms, Holmes returned once more to the images from the chapel room and Stillwater's final writings. He placed them beside a fresh photograph of the mirror, now locked in Scotland Yard's evidence vault. Soon, Lestrade assured us, to be dismantled piece by piece. Holmes stood in silence, his hand resting on the folded edge of Stillwater's final note. "The last reflection is not in the mirror," he repeated softly. I poured 2 cups of tea and set one beside him. "Do you think that means Calhoun, that Stillwater foresaw his manipulations?" Holmes looked out the window, his gaze steady on the far rooftops where the light was beginning to dim again. "No," he said after a pause. "I think it meant us. That the final judgment lies not in the mirror nor in those who build it, but in those who choose whether to look." And with that, he turned away from the table and let the room grow dark. The following day dawned under a dull London sky, the light sifting through Baker Street's lace curtains as if reluctant to intrude. I found Holmes already seated at the breakfast table, not touching the tea Mrs. Hudson had brought in, but instead leafing through a sheaf of notes scribbled in Stillwater's hand. The same retrieved from the mausoleum, then cross-referenced with the copies in the oilskin folio. He looked up as I entered. "Watson, there's something unresolved here," he said without preamble. Stillwater's notes contain references to a figure he only names as the Quiet One, a person he credits with granting him access to the chapel records and urging him to pursue the inheritance forgery, but whose identity he deliberately omits. "You don't believe it was Calhoun?" Number Calhoun enabled the technical execution of the mirror, but this figure predates his involvement. Stillwater's earliest entries speak of whispered encouragement, of a voice behind the curtain who led him to the club in the first place. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, pulling from the shelf a narrow volume, Stillwater's collected verses, published years before his death. Holmes flipped to the flyleaf and showed it to me. A simple dedication written in an elegant, looping hand. "To the Quiet One, who first let me see." My pulse quickened. Then Stillwater had been under this person's influence for years. Indeed, and this person is still missing from our ledger. We've accounted for Tranter, Montferrand, Miss Vale, Calhoun, but this final voice remains unclaimed. Holmes returned to the desk and unrolled a club register that Lestrade had provided 2 days prior. His finger ran down the names. Then he paused. "Here, a minor entry, unremarkable on first glance. A Miss Iris Fenchurch, listed not as a member, but as an archivist in residence. Only appeared in club documentation for 2 seasons. No address given, no later reference." I blinked. I don't recall hearing that name at all during our investigation. Precisely. She has vanished from memory, and yet she was the club's only designated archivist. If anyone would know the full extent of the club's darker history, it would be her. He rolled up the register and stood. "I believe it is time, Watson, that we look beyond the reflections and speak to the person who first drew Stillwater into the shadows." Tracking down Iris Fenchurch proved no easy task. There were no public records of her after 1899, and no forwarding address in any of the Looking Glass Club's archives. It was not until late afternoon that a line from one of Stillwater's early poems, "Where the ivy climbs in silence and the past sleeps in wax," guided Holmes to the conclusion that the woman had, in fact, taken employment at the London Waxwork Museum in Whitechapel, where she had worked in seclusion cataloguing historical letters and artifacts for private patrons. We arrived just as the museum was closing, and after a short conversation with the caretaker, a man Holmes somehow convinced we were there for a matter of intellectual copyright, we were led down into the archives beneath the wax halls. There, under low electric lamps, amid rows of grim-faced effigies and yellowing ledgers, we found her. Miss Iris Fenchurch was a tall woman of indeterminate age, with iron-grey hair drawn back severely and a voice so soft it compelled silence rather than invited it. "I knew you would come," she said, without surprise. Holmes inclined his head. "Then you know why." She gestured to a small work table crowded with scrolls, half-assembled wax limbs and meticulous index cards. Stillwater was never meant to be caught in the glass. He was meant to step through it. You gave him the original evidence of the Montferrand forgery. I did. You told him about the chapel room. I did. Holmes folded his arms. Why? Her eyes drifted toward a shadowed wax figure near the far wall, an indistinct nobleman whose glassy stare returned nothing. Because I was the club's memory, she said. I was meant to preserve its rituals, its secrets. But I saw what they became, how each generation rewrote its guilt. I could not destroy it myself, so I showed him the way. And Calhoun? Holmes asked. Did you bring him in as well? Number Y had already left by then. By the time he arrived, the club had grown bold. Too bold. They forgot that mirrors are not just for seeing oneself, but for being seen. Holmes stepped closer. You understand, Miss Fenchurch, that aiding Stillwater placed you in the center of a murder investigation. I do, but I also know the difference between a death and a disappearance. Her gaze turned to me. You see, Doctor, Quentin Stillwater did not die in that room. He became what he had intended, a reflection that could not be silenced. I struggled to answer. There was no madness in her voice, only certainty. Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then said softly, Then you understand that we must include your name in the record. She nodded. Let history do what it must. Just be certain it sees everything. We returned to Baker Street in silence. It was late, and the fire had burned down to coals when Holmes laid the final pages of the case in their folder. Stillwater's writings, the forged documents, the photograph of the chapel room, Calhoun's arrest report, and now a signed testimony from Iris Fenchurch, given without fear or conditions, in a wax museum far from the city's noise. He tied the folder with red ribbon and placed it in the locked cabinet beneath the floorboard. As he stood and poured himself a measure of brandy, I asked, And now? Now, Holmes said, the case ends. But you don't look satisfied. He paused. Then, with a glance at the mirror above the fireplace, simple, unadorned, and honest, he said, Because justice was only part of it, Watson. The rest was vision. Stillwater saw what they had all become, and in trying to reveal it, he built something greater than we could dismantle. He drank slowly, then set the glass down. He wanted to be remembered not for who he was, but for what he showed us. I nodded, watching the reflection in the fireplace glass. And for once, it did not lie. The final days of the affair passed in a hush, not with the thunderclap of scandal or the cries of the exposed, but with the steady closing of doors. The Looking-Glass Club was quietly dissolved by its remaining board, its archives seized by the Crown. Montferrand, despite a phalanx of solicitors, was formally charged, though Holmes noted with some distaste that the charge was framed as gross negligence rather than conspiracy. Tranter accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for full testimony. As for Calhoun, his trial loomed with mounting pressure from scientific circles demanding his research be sequestered indefinitely. Stillwater's name, once whispered as eccentric and unstable, now hovered in the air like an elegy. His poetry was reissued, his final verses quoted in periodicals as the voice of a man who had seen too clearly. It was not fame in the common sense, but something stranger, recognition without comfort. We stood together 1 week later in Kensal Green, not at the mausoleum this time, but before a modest stone that had been newly set among the older graves. The inscription was simple: Quentin Stillwater, 1873 to 1901. I reflected what you feared to see. Holmes removed his hat and was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was not to me, but to the grave. He thought he would be silenced, he murmured. But his silence speaks louder now than all the voices that tried to outshout it. They said nothing. Some truths, as Holmes had once remarked, do not require amplification, only a place to stand. We returned to Baker Street in time to find a final envelope waiting. No postmark, no name. Inside, a single photograph. It showed Holmes and me standing in the Orpheum's backstage, the mirror uncovered behind us. We had not known we were being observed. The photograph had been taken from the theatre's wings, its angle precise, its composition chilling. Across the bottom, in the same elegant script as Stillwater's dedication, were the words, "The mirror remains." Holmes stared at it for a long moment, then slowly set it in the hearth fire. The flames took it with a soft curl of smoke. "From her," he said at last. "Miss Fenchurch?" He nodded. "She wants us to know the idea cannot be burned, even if the evidence can." I looked toward the mirror above the mantel, its plain surface catching only the flicker of firelight and our own quiet shapes. And what now? Holmes turned toward the window, hands behind his back. "Now we wait for the next shadow to step forward, because they always do, Watson. Mirrors may crack, but someone always comes looking to piece them together again." He said no more that night. The fire died low. Outside, London moved on, unaware, or perhaps unready, to acknowledge what had been unearthed. And yet, in the quiet that followed, I wrote the final line of my account with the clarity Stillwater had sought. The case was not about a mirror. It was about the fear of being seen. And Holmes, with all his logic and all his brilliance, had seen them, each and every one, 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 each and every one,